This is Yesterzine, where we find old games and test a zine, while also giving you a flavour of what was going on in the Yesterscene. It's also where we think wordplay makes us somehow the best. A zine. Speaking of the best, our magazine this week, CVG from September 1996, proudly proclaimed they were reviewing the 3 greatest games of all time. Quite apart from demonstrating their poor grasp of narrative tension, that's a bold claim, and one that, with the passage of time, we couldn't resist the chance to evaluate. All 3 of these games were, at the time at least, exclusives on their platforms, so they must have aged differently. On this, the season finale of Yesterzine, we're going to climb off the fence, stick our necks out and crown a winner. And we start with Quake, the least famous of the trilogy of id 90s greats. Admittedly, mostly because of the recent run of sequels, I think most people would know Wolfenstein. Even if they don't know that 1992's Wolfenstein 3D really created the first-person shooter genre. There's 2 ways you know how old Wolfenstein is. Firstly, that it's such an early 3D game they felt it necessary to put 3D in the name. And secondly, because it's not, in fact, 3D. There's no height to anything in Wolfenstein 3D. The game takes place inside buildings with all the meaningful character of a new build housing estate. Everything is the same ceiling height, there's no stairs, and not even lifts other than between maps. Ah, you'll say. But they solved that in their next and most famous game, Doom, didn't they? Well, no, I'll reply, wondering how you got into my house in the first place. Doom, despite adding stairs, lifts, and multiple height rooms, is held together by cunning artifice. Doom is also a 2D game. The engine can't handle floors above other floors, and the entire map can be drawn perfectly in 2D, as the game itself does. There's not even any way of aiming up or down in the original Doom engine. If you shoot something above you, the game just handles it. Which is why Quake is important. Like Mario 64, as we'll see later, Quake was not the first in its subgenre, but it was where proper 3D first-person shooters with the mouse and keyboard scheme we know today went mainstream. And yet, Quake is probably the obscure one. Probably due to not having a proper sequel since 2005's unloved Quake 4, which the original designer John Romero considers more of a Doom game with the Quake name anyway. But being first doesn't give it a free pass. First things first, the original DOS version as CVG would have seen it. And 2 things are immediately clear. Or rather, one thing is immediately not clear. This is a very low resolution game, which becomes a problem when it also has this much texture detail. It's very smudgy, and it doesn't help that it's awfully fond of a palette that runs the whole gamut from brown to greenish brown. The other thing is, for what must have been a reason, while it is fully 3D and has mouse look, and you can look up and down, you can't look up and down with the mouse. For some reason, if I need to see above me, I have to move across the keyboard to do it. This is strangely disconcerting when you're used to modern shooters, even more so than if it wasn't a 3D game. So, given we're reviewing based on modern times, I think we should fudge this. Quake is now open source, which means people can modify the game easily to work on Windows, have different controls, or even run in high resolution. If you're playing Quake in 2019 for the first time, this is how you'll do it. So it's how we're going to do it. And, thanks to the magic of YouTube, for us it's as easy as 1, 2, 3. Right, this is better. We're using Quake Spasm, which unzips straight over your Quake install and gives you high definition graphics, proper mouse look, and music compatibility via MP3s ripped from the original CD. It's still brown though. Really very brown. Mechanically, it's a very similar game to Doom if we're honest. The monsters are different, but most of the weapons have an equivalent, and it still carries the health and armour system and keycard gates that seem a bit clunky in this day and age. There's no weapon with infinite ammo either, so conservation is at least partially the order of the day, which never sat well with me in an arcade first-person shooter. The brown aesthetic also means that the level design, while neat and at times spectacular, doesn't lend itself to navigation especially well. Plus, they seem to have solved the problem of mapping 3D levels into a 2D on-screen map by simply not including one. Plus, For some reason, playing Quake for any length of time is actually making me feel a bit ill, which is strange since I'm absolutely fine with almost every other game, including VR. So I called Yestazine's Quake expert Rex, and after comments such as, "Why are you ringing me?" and "It's 2:30 AM, can't this wait?" she offered the following thoughts.
The graphics from the original, not the updated version of the original, but the original, dear God. They are some people's idea of a dream when it comes to pixel art, and my idea of some sort of chaotic hell when you're looking around, because everything is so pixelated. Maybe it's the high-res screens that we're using nowadays, or the just how large our screens are. I don't remember it feeling like that when I was that young, but now it feels like an assault on your senses. And the guys are slow. I remember them, you'd go around a corner and someone would attack you really quick, and you're like, I had to react. And I think I have the same idea in Wolfenstein and Doom when I was playing those at the same age. It was just like quite intense. You're in a dark space, you're walking around, and then people keep attacking you, and you have to move really quick. And you better get those med boxes. Hurry up, get those med boxes. But I don't remember actually enjoying the gameplay all that much, because it wasn't dissimilar to things like Doom. What I do remember mostly with Quake is playing in death matches, lots of death matches, often with people who were far better Quake players than me, and running around in these death matches and being killed really quickly and having to respawn and then being killed again. And I actually found that a lot more fun, even though I kept dying because I was abysmal at it, than the game itself, because of the multiplayer element and because of the different weapons. And you could just go, okay, everyone, we're just going to go crowbars only, to try and even it out from people who had better guns. And that was way more fun, that idea. And I think it's something MMOs have captured now that we actually had in the 90s and I'd kind of forgotten about.
I think it's fair to say both that Quake has aged, but also that most of the genre, for good or bad, used it as a base. Perhaps even more so than Doom, given that for a long time after, first-person shooters went with the lower enemy count and generally brown aesthetic this game ushered in. Should you play it now? Probably not, but if you do it with QuakeSpasm installed. There's more than enough room for either of our other two greatest games to be crowned the champion. This isn't going to be one I'm going to win. Mario 64 is easily the most famous of our three best ever games. Beloved by millions, still tops people's lists today. Either I love it all over again and people will say I've added no insight, or I don't like it and I'll probably have to change name and go live as a hermit to escape the backlash. Of the three best games ever in this issue, I suspect Mario 64 is the one I don't have to explain, so let's keep this short. This is the first Mario 3D platformer, released as the launch title for the N64. Even just the intro is iconic.
It's me, Mario! Hello!
Hey Mario, stop hitting yourself! Stop hitting yourself! Why are you hitting yourself? Playing Mario 64 again, I'd forgotten how much Mario Odyssey owes to it. And that's the best game on the Switch. Don't post web pages suggesting otherwise in the comments, by the way. Odyssey is the best, and no link is going to prove me wrong. But if it's been a couple of decades, as it was for me, or you never played 64 at the time, then the star system is in full effect here. Each level has a main power star, or objective, usually from a boss, which is then followed up by a bunch of hidden stars. The first example you're likely to encounter, for instance, is this race up a hill against Koopa, which is unlocked by beating the first boss. Further stars are hidden behind switches like this, that can be activated by finding hidden courses. So there's the core platform game, like we remember from the likes of Super Mario World, but in 3D, followed by a secret system that rewards exploring pretty massive open worlds. It's very neatly catering both for idiots like me, and for people with all the time and skill in the world, and those competent bastards could lose months to this thing. Looks-wise, it's holding up remarkably well too. Unlike both Quake and Knights in their original guises, everything here is visible, clear, and the draw distance is everything you need it to be. Where Mario 64 has aged is not its fault. Let me explain. The N64 was a remarkably powerful machine, but its memory for textures, the detail actually on flat surfaces, was miserly then and hilarious now, clocking in at 4 kilobytes a texture. That's 1/25th of a Sinclair Spectrum game. And it gets worse. Because of the way N64 scales textures according to distance, in practice the limit is half that. 2 kilobytes. The text script of this episode since we started talking about Mario 64 is more than that. And that's what accounts for these fuzzy repeating textures about the place. It really doesn't affect Mario 64 that badly though. Cartoon worlds lend themselves to this kind of thing anyway, and some of the level design does an incredible job of masking it. Even the water looks pretty good still, which is always a way to spot an old game. There's a fidelity to the open world that 3D games from this period simply don't have. Instances of texture gaps are much rarer than anything the PlayStation was doing, and low resolution textures notwithstanding, there's none of the muddiness of games like Knights, or even something like Croc 3D, which is a pretty good illustration of where the PlayStation was at this point. The camera too is much better than anything of its era. It's introduced to you at the start as the Lakitu brothers filming you for their news channel. At this point, I'm surprised Peach getting herself kidnapped by Bowser is still newsworthy. But given the Mushroom Kingdom isn't in the middle of Mushsick from the Toadstool Union, I guess there's very little else to talk about. Generally, it makes pretty good decisions about where to point itself, and it can be corrected using the C buttons the N64 had in lieu of a second analog stick. Although this is at fixed increments, and the camera being a physical presence means you sometimes can't move it because part of Lakitu would go through a wall. I can't honestly say it's got in my way more than a couple of times so far though, and you'd rack up that in the first 14 seconds playing the first Tomb Raider game, which was released at almost exactly the same time. The only other issue I found is that reading some of the many signs or talking to characters requires needlessly precise positioning. I've punched so many signs I've probably now got more wood than your mum. And my standard introduction to most characters is to punch them in the face, which is not how I recommend acting at your next high society tea party. But if that's what I'm stretching to for faults, then you can see Mario 64 is something very special indeed. Most series stumbled a little in their transition to 3D. Sonic, for instance, stumbled, fell down the stairs, smacked itself in the face on the wall, staggered sideways and then fell down another 700 flights of stairs. Mario doesn't. Mario 64, by comparison, slides down the banister, somersaults off the bottom and collects a power star doing it. The Saturn was ultimately a commercial failure, and surely one of the reasons for that is it never got its own proper Sonic game. There was never going to be one at launch, not from Sonic Team at least. The epic two-part Sonic 3 and Knuckles project was only finished a month before the Japanese launch of the Saturn, and well less than a year before us Europeans got it. The burnout from that being twice as big and taking at least twice as long as it should have done led to Sonic Team requesting a change. With remarkably high level of care for employee morale, Sega agreed. They did cover their bases. Sega Technical Institute, who had helped on Sonic 2 and written Sonic Spinball, were working on a last 2D sequel for the Genesis, but development of this was moved to the Sega Saturn and reworked as a 3D title to be known as Sonic X-treme. Yes, that's X-treme. If you somehow hadn't realised this was the 90s, now there's proof. The story of X-treme's development is one that should be covered properly some other time, but a combination of internal Sega politics, arguments over game engines, and deadlines so X-stream that much of the team literally worked themselves into illness meant the game was ultimately cancelled. In the event, the Saturn never got its own Sonic game, receiving only a hastily commissioned conversion of the final Mega Drive title, Sonic 3D, a compilation of the 4 main Mega Drive titles called Sonic Jam, and Sonic R, an unloved stab at Mario Kart with possibly the most Sega music of any game ever. This, though, is what Sonic Team did next, and perhaps thanks to the Saturn's untimely demise, if Quake's a little obscure, among today's gamers, Nights is so underground that it's usually only played by the Wombles. Nights is a score attack game set inside children's dreams. The two children in question are Clarice and Elliot, who at the start of the game have all their positive emotions stolen by generic evil villain number 12, and enlist the help of androgynous, Sonic viewed at the wrong aspect ratio protagonist Nights to get them back. This isn't a platform game. Nights flies through a 2.5D space collecting sufficient blue orbs to return to the cage in the centre of the level to unlock one of the 4 emotions. After 4 rounds of this in each nightmare, there's one in a series of increasingly inventive boss fights. Other than a time limit, the game ranks you on, effectively, style. Blue orbs become points-paying gold orbs. There are trick gates that allow you to rack up huge multiples by quickly throwing some shapes like it's closing time in the club and the Volca Red Ball is wearing off. By linking rings, tricks, smacking enemies and being generally cool in the bonus time, you rack up points, which is important. To move on to the next nightmare, you need to both complete the level and be awarded at least a C grade. It's basically like German GCSE but with slightly fewer nightmares. That's the meat of the game. Nights is short. Both children only have 3 nightmares of their own and a shared final level. The replayability is in the high score challenge, taking advantage of links to rack up huge totals and keep combos going as long as possible. Nights was the first Saturn game to use the 3D analog pad, and it's vital here to have any hope of anything other than just scraping through. Nights has its issues with age. Chief amongst them, in my first few goes, was a combination of its very zoomed in perspective and low resolution Saturn fuzziness, meaning it was pretty tricky to figure out where I was actually going or quite what several of the things were. If you have a PC and want to play Nights now, you could emulate it. Saturn emulation lagged well behind the PlayStation for a long time, but emulators like Yabuse are now practically perfect, and that's what we've used so far to capture all the footage. But there's also this, a lovely high-definition remake based on a remastered PlayStation 2 port. It was released on Steam in 2012, and as such pretty much runs on a potato by 2019 standards. It fixes the resolution problem, comfortably running above 1080p on my not especially new PC, but it still features that presumably deliberate zoom. I guess it's meant to reward perseverance and learning, but to me it's too claustrophobic. That said, Nights is still a unique and wonderful beast. If you're just looking for something to dip into in 2019, that PC port is generally around a $5, and the few hours you'll spend just completing the story will be time well spent. Other than a single, almost forgotten Wii sequel in 2007, there's not a lot like it around. Given some of the stuff Sonic Team farted out in that decade, I think I'm glad we got this rather than a proper Sonic sequel, even if Sega's bottom line probably isn't. So, 3 fine games. I'm not even sure at the time I'd have gone quite as overboard as CVG did on their cover about them, but all 3 are absolutely deserving of their score by period standards. Which though should you play today? Well, it's not Quake, especially in its original form. It's probably a tribute to it that so many shooters have done what it did, but better. The problem with that is, they have done it better. To be fair, the shareware version is free, and getting it running in high resolution is easy, so maybe there are worse ways to spend an idle hour than speeding through episode 1. Still, graphically especially, the thing has aged. It's not even the easily fixed resolution issues, but the intense green brownness. I'm sure they were going for an aesthetic, but it's just not one that works anymore. If you want a high-paced, enemy-heavy shooter from id, but you'd like it to be beautiful, then there's a very easy solution. The Doom remake from a couple of years back is bloody marvellous, and it really is everything Quake is trying to be here, but better. It's on PC, and all 3 current consoles, including the Nintendo Switch, where a remarkably produced conversion should be the wingman for your next long public transport journey. Quake itself, though, is only getting a bronze medal out of this 3-way. Although, to be fair, is there any other colour it would prefer? Nights I was least familiar with. I didn't have a Saturn at the right time, and my physical library for that machine consists of what I found in charity shops a decade after the fact. Apparently, that never included a copy of this, either because it didn't sell, or more likely because when people have a copy, they tend to hold on to it. You don't see many major score attack games these days. it tends to be the preserve of the smaller indie developers. And if that's Knight's competition, then actually the remake holds up incredibly well today. If the game had never existed, I suspect if someone like Mike Blithell or Size 5 Games had released the 2012 PC version today, then it would have got a very positive reception. And of course at a $5, it's basically already a cheap indie game title. If you've never played it, then you should spend that $5 and pretend it's a new release. The only clue is the fairly pointless Saturn version in the main menu anyway. If our criteria is how games aged, with a little makeover, Knights basically hasn't. Mario 64 also remains magnificent. Knights has the advantage of no popular direct sequels, whereas we haven't been able to move for Mario games in both 2D and 3D ever since. Still though, it stands tall, with remarkably little of the early 3D jankiness we've come to expect. If you tweaked the camera system and released a Switch port, it'd probably still be the second best game on that system, and don't hold your breath of the world for me to change my mind. But since the only other way to play Mario 64 is a less than perfect DS port, you're going to need to get yourself an N64 and play this. If you enjoyed Odyssey, you owe it to yourself to do so. Does it win the episode? That's a harder question. Because if you ask me now which I want to go on, then Knights runs it very, very close. Knights can be enjoyed in 5 minutes. Mario 64 can't really. But you're never going to lose a weekend to star collecting in Knights in 2019, so our winner has to be Mario. That said, play both our top 2. But Quake? Get yourself the superb new Doom port and leave it in well-deserved and dignified retirement. On the official Yestazine grandfather scale, Mario 64 is the one who builds you your first bike, Knights is the one that runs marathons for charity, and Quake is the slightly racist one whose lawn you probably don't want to be on. There's a rather significant game buried in this issue, getting a non-committal 3 out of 5 and an "it's alright we guess" review. However, in 2019, it's a game with probably more influence on today's gamers than even Mario 64. Let's play a little game of Guess Who. I'll drop in some clues. The game in question is this, Mototoon Grand Prix 2, or just Mototoon Grand Prix in the West, as we never got the original game. Mototoon is thus the first time UK gamers would see a small company called Polly's Entertainment. That name is clue 1. What you're probably assuming you're seeing here is a cheap Mario Kart clone, with the most Japanese intro of all time. And you're not entirely wrong. I mean, this is a very Japanese intro. Take a listen. That intro is clue 2, and you'll realise why later. Yes, visually, cheap Mario Kart clone is exactly what Mototoon is. And essentially, the reason it exists is for Sony just to cover that base with the PlayStation in an era before games like Crash Nitro Kart. There's a little more to this one though. To explain more, we called clue 3 the game's designer, Kazunori Yamauchi. And after comments such as, "Why are you ringing me?" and "It's 2:30 AM, can't this wait?" he offered the following thoughts.
Basically, we're not trying to fake reality. I'd rather create the sensation of handling a remote control car, but with the kind of dynamics that you'd expect from a real car. The car's suspensions actually work. We've attempted to simulate the dynamic forces as they go around corners.
So, the name Polly, the over-the-top, over-the-Japanese intro, a team interested in vehicle dynamics, a lead designer called Kaz. Who would live in a game like this? For those still not with us, Mototoon 1 and 2 were produced essentially as payment to Sony by Polly's, traded against the promise that once finished, they'd be able to work on the game they wanted to write in the first place, a real driving simulator. That last second clue has probably done it for anyone who's owned a PlayStation in the last 20 years, because that real driving simulator is this. 2 years after Mototoon, the newly renamed Polyphony Digital released Gran Turismo. This is one of those times that you can really say, and the rest is history. Gran Turismo, while always in competition with Microsoft's Forza Motorsport, yes, that's how it's pronounced, YouTube, redefined near simulation driving games. It's the reason we now expect a 3-figure number of real vehicles from real manufacturers in our games. It's the reason that we expect to be able to upgrade those cars with credibly real parts. It's why we expect car washes, long career modes and endurance races with tyre wear. It's one of those game series that even non-gamers will recognise, and it's been intrinsically linked to real racing from the start. The GT Academy, established in 2008, is open to anyone racing online to enter. Get through the virtual rounds, and the national final winners head to Silverstone for a week-long race camp, out of which the winner ends up with a professional contract to race for Nissan. Winners have included Le Mans podium finishers Lucas Ordonez and Jan Mardenborough, as well as this man, Brian Heitkotter, who I spent most of the very late 90s racing against on the old GranTurismo.com forums. iRacing and esports in general get a lot of the credit for simulation experience transferring to the real world, but it was Polyphony and Gran Turismo that got there first. But what about the prehistory? Can a theoretically arcade karting game work when underpinning it is an engine that will go on to train Le Mans winners? Well yeah, sort of. While this isn't Gran Turismo, it also isn't Mario Kart. The physics lie in the middle somewhere, but in a really great way. Yes, you're going to need the brake button a bit, but you can use it to pitch yourself into some really satisfying drifts. Here, for instance, where I drift right round the outside of the opponent, is a joy. Once you teach your hands this method of driving, it's really natural, and most of the time it flows well, with the exception maybe of this slightly over-fussy section of a later track where there aren't any walls. The drifting, probably, is a legacy of the karts knowing they have suspension in a way a Mario Kart doesn't, the kart leaning on the outside springs round the corner, an effect that works well with the exaggerated cartoony wobble the cars have in this game, a graphical feature that adds a lot to the charm. And those graphics are super impressive for the time, actually. GT was considered a major beauty on release, and that's clearly down to the work here. These first 24-month 3D games were normally plagued with texture gaps. Look at the road as we go down this hill in Rage Racer, for example. Pop-up, where large objects suddenly appear, is happening way further down the track, and even Mario 64 has a bit of that. It's certainly not at the expense of frame rate either. I'm pretty certain this is doing a solid 30 frames a second, which is state of the 1996 art. There's a huge amount of scenery too. The signs, the trees, even aircraft above sometimes are all things other teams couldn't have pulled off. The track design is fun. This first track is relatively sensible, could have come from any number of slightly cartoony driving games. But in this, the first of 2 championships, it quickly gets more interesting, with this transparent road in the third course. And then later, this casino-based course that feels like a 3D best-of compilation of all the tracks from Micro Machines, which we saw a couple of episodes back. You can absolutely see where this was a test run for Gran Turismo. It's clearly a slightly earlier version of both its 3D engine and its physics. And look at the screen furniture. The map, rev counter, and timing information here in Gran Turismo is almost all the same in terms of layout and style. Although, as you can see from my exploits here, Mototoon is much more forgiving of digital controls than GT is. Which is good, because unlike GT, it doesn't support analog at all. If you've ever played and enjoyed a Gran Turismo game, get yourself a copy of this. While it's 10 tracks, 5 characters, and slight arcade sim identity crisis means I'm not going to debate the 3 out of 5 CVG gave it, it's absolutely worth you going and getting and educating yourself on a game few will ever play, but all 85 million people who have ever bought a Gran Turismo owe a debt of gratitude to. There may have been 3 gaming heavens in this issue, but there's only one standout hell. And it's this. Saturn vertically scrolling shooter Sonic Wings Special is the only 1 out of 5 game in the issue. You've probably not heard of Sonic Wings. This was the only one of the reasonably long-running series to get a UK release under this name. The rest were known, both in the arcades and various home conversions, as Aero Fighters. I mean, you've probably not heard of that either, but at least then it's sort of your fault. Sonic Wings is an old-school 2D top-down shooter, and in their pretty tiny review of it, that's basically what CVG didn't like. We're in that slightly strange period of gaming where people had finally got the arcade-perfect conversions they'd always wanted, and we're now discovering that the thing about arcade games is they're here for a good time, not a long time. I did suspect before I played this game that CVG were pretty much only covering it in order to make this point, spending most of the review complaining that it's unoriginal and, in their view, ugly. A review that incidentally has a lower word count than this section of the script has already had. Playing the game bears that out. It's an arcade shoot 'em up. And it's a pretty good one by those standards. To my eyes, it's pretty good looking too. The backgrounds are detailed, the enemies plentiful, and with varied attack patterns. It's probably a little slow, but that was the style at the time. For proof of both this and how far we came with the jump to 32-bit, here's Xenon 2 and the Mega Drive as a comparison piece. There's another quibble. The difficulty level seems a little off to me. I'm terrible at these, but I breezed through the first 2 of the 9 stages in a game, and then came to a dead stop of stage 3 of my first go. At least partly this might be caused by quite a neat system where, after stage 1, the game secretly chooses 3 stages from a pool of 5 as your next destinations. And further branches occur later in the game too. A complete 9-stage run will still only show you a little over half the available 17 stages. None of this is in the CVG review, and I feel that in general that does the game a disservice. Yes, it's thin. It's an arcade conversion of a vertically scrolling bullet hell shooter for treasure's sake. Even so, the conversion adds a full 7 stages the arcade didn't have, and for those of us in 2019 not paying full price, this is an entertaining time. Given that elsewhere on the same page there's a Worms port that's literally missing the most useful weapon in the game and somehow still gets 2 out of 5, I think Video System would be entitled to feel hard done by here. Incidentally, if you want to prove me wrong, the game's PlayStation port was released on PSN for PlayStation 3, Vita, PSP and PlayStation TV, and is still available for £4. There was also an Android version in 2012. It doesn't seem to be available in the Google Play Store anymore, but I doubt that'll stop you finding it. And that's our first season, and our final back page for now. And on that back page, remember Plock? He's back, in comic form. If you don't remember Plock, it's this lovely side-scroller from the Pickford brothers, purveyors of fine gameables and even finer beards for 3 decades now. It's a game endorsed by no less a figure than Shigeru Miyamoto, and he knows the odd thing about decent platformers. Somehow, the Pickfords kept the rights to the character, and in 2013 they launched it as a webcomic. You'll find it at z3.com. Turning to the inside back page, we point out that clicking the button and bell for subscriptions will alert you when the secret bonus episodes appear, and indeed make you the first to know when plans for Season 2 are formed. If you missed any episodes, check out the Yestazine playlist to watch all 6 again. If you wish to find out what we're doing on our summer holidays, check out yestazine.co.uk and send us postcards to yestazineshow@gmail.com. You'll also find us on Twitter as Yestazine. Feel free to follow us and suggest backpage adverts for next season. But time now to put that Season 1 binder on the shelf, and until next time you'll find us flying through our nightmares. Watch for some specials in the meantime, but until Season 2, stay fresh, cheese bags.